On February 29, 2004, Peter Jackson and The Lord of the Rings broke the Oscars. The first two films in the Lord of the Rings trilogy had already proven themselves as Oscar winners, claiming a handful of awards in the technical categories. But the finale of this epic trilogy was about to do the impossible. That night in February, The Return of the King went 11 for 11, tying the all-time record for wins in a single night, cementing the largest clean sweep in cinematic history, and claiming the very first Best Picture win for a fantasy film. So how did this happen? Why had fantasy never won before, and what made The Return of the King different? Did Peter Jackson and his crew deserve to win all 11 Oscars? Or was the Academy simply honoring the trilogy as a whole, not specifically the final film? My name is Gibby, and welcome back to Fact or Fantasy. These questions have swirled around for the last 2 decades, and now 22 years removed from the actual event, we have a clearer picture of what really happened that night in 2004. So in this video, join me as we relive these epic wins, diving into the history of fantasy at the Oscars, uncovering the massive marketing campaign behind the wins, and finally answering the question, did they deserve it? To understand why 2004 was such a shock to the system, we have to look at the massive F word. In Hollywood, for a very long time, fantasy was a dirty word. If you were a filmmaker and you wanted to be taken seriously at the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, you didn't make a movie about dragons, magic rings, or chosen ones. You made historical biopics. You made gritty war dramas. You made sweeping romances set in the 1940s. For the first 75 years of the Oscars, the Academy had a very specific type, and fantasy, no matter how well made, was almost always viewed as escapism or children's entertainment. It was seen as a technical exercise rather than high art. Think about the giants that came before Tolkien's world reached the screen. In 1939, The Wizard of Oz, a film that is arguably the DNA of modern cinema, lost Best Picture to Gone with the Wind. In 1977, Star Wars literally changed the world, but it lost Best Picture to Annie Hall. And then in 1982, E.T. the Extraterrestrial lost to Gandhi. The pattern was clear. The Academy was happy to give George Lucas or Steven Spielberg awards for their toys, the sound, visual effects, and the music, but when it came to the important awards like Best Director or Best Picture, they almost always chose history over imagination. This established what was effectively a technical consolation prize. It was a pattern where genre films were relegated to the craft categories, honored for their tools and their spectacle, as a way for the Academy to acknowledge the production scale without ever admitting that the story itself deserved to sit at the high table of cinema. We saw this play out in real time with the first 2 installments of The Lord of the Rings. In 2002, The Fellowship of the Ring led the pack with 13 nominations, more than any other film that year. But on Oscar night, it only took home 4 awards, and every single one of them was technical. It lost Best Picture to A Beautiful Mind, and a year later, The Two Towers won just 2 Oscars, again both technical, while Chicago took the top prize. By the time 2004 rolled around, there was a palpable sense of now or never. The glass ceiling was reinforced, and the industry was watching to see if the Academy would finally blink. The Return of the King wasn't just another nomination, it was the ultimate test for the entire genre. Tolkien once wrote in his essay on fairy stories that the consolation of the happy ending is the highest function of a fairy story. He called it the eucatastrophe, the sudden, joyous turn of events. Going into that night in February, the entire fantasy community was waiting for their own eucatastrophe. Because if a 10-hour cinematic achievement that had become the pinnacle of the genre couldn't win, then nothing ever would. But as we know, the Academy did more than just blink. They surrendered. So how did Peter Jackson turn a 75-year-old bias into an 11-win clean sweep? While the film itself is of course a breathtaking piece of cinema, and don't worry, we'll talk about that more later in the video, I would be doing you a disservice if I didn't acknowledge something else that was happening behind the scenes. You see, winning an Academy Award is more than just visual mastery. It's a lot of meetings, shaking hands, and PR. Much of what we know about this behind-the-scenes push in 2004 comes from an incredible oral history by Alex Suskind, which reveals just how calculated this victory really was. New Line Cinema knew that simply making a great movie wasn't going to be enough to break a 75-year-old curse. They had to run a campaign that was just as aggressive as a presidential election. For the first two films, the marketing was about world building and getting it out there to the fans. It was about proving that Middle-earth could exist on screen. But for the finale, the strategy shifted. They stopped selling a fantasy movie and started selling a cultural landmark. To pull this off, New Line's then president of theatrical marketing, Russell Schwartz, hired a specialized team of PR experts and awards consultants. He reportedly told them point blank, "It will be a disaster if we don't win this." And this campaign wasn't cheap. While the movie cost about $94 million to produce, New Line poured an additional $10 million specifically into the Oscar campaign alone. They weren't just buying billboard space, they were buying a narrative. And the genius of this narrative was what they called the cumulative achievement strategy. They successfully convinced the Academy voters that a vote for the Return of the King wasn't just a vote for one film. It was a vote to honor the entire 8-year journey. They essentially presented the Academy with a bill for the last 3 years of cinematic history and said, it's time to pay up. If you look at the For Your Consideration ads from that season, you'll notice that they didn't focus on the orcs, the magic, or the large battles. They focused on the faces of the actors. They highlighted the emotional stakes and the sheer exhausting human effort it took to bring this story to life. They made it feel like it would be a historical mistake not to reward it. By the time the ballots were cast, the industry wasn't just talking about hobbits anymore. They were talking about a once-in-a-generation achievement. The campaign had successfully persuaded the Academy into realizing that if they didn't crown the king now, they might never get the chance to be on the right side of history again. So the marketing campaign was brilliant, and the Academy was primed to finally honor the genre. But let's be incredibly clear about something. PR campaigns don't win 11 Oscars if the movie can't back it up. A great campaign can get you a nomination, but it takes a generational masterpiece to actually secure the gold. When The Return of the King swept the 76th Academy Awards, it wasn't just a Lifetime Achievement Award for the trilogy. It was a recognition of a production team that had pushed the boundaries of cinema to their absolute breaking point. So let's break down exactly how they went 11 for 11, starting with the physical world they built from the ground up. By taking home the Best Visual Effects Award, The Lord of the Rings joined the original Star Wars trilogy as the only franchises in history to win the visual effects Oscar for every single installment. And it's not hard to see why. The Return of the King boasted around 1,500 visual effects shots, a massive exponential leap from the previous films that firmly planted Weta Digital at the absolute vanguard of the global VFX industry. The crown jewel of this technical run was a little program called Massive. To pull off the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, Weta had to simulate a conflict on a scale that cinema had never seen before. Instead of hand-animating thousands of background orcs and repetitive, predictable loops, developer Steven Regelis created software that gave these digital armies actual brains. Each individual unit or agent was programmed with primitive artificial intelligence. They could perceive their environment, distinguish friend from foe, and make autonomous combat decisions using motion-captured fighting styles. This created a chaotic, highly realistic battlefield that fundamentally changed how Hollywood approaches large-scale warfare forever. Then you have Shelob. To keep her from looking like a generic, artificial CGI monster, the team grounded her entirely in biological reality, giving her a luminous, corrupted underbelly, a realistic thorax, and heavy, hair-covered limbs. The texture painters went so far as to detail the wet, fleshy inside of her mouth just for that one skin-crawling down-the-throat camera move designed to make the audience squirm. Combined with cinematographer Andrew Lesnie's classic horror lighting, a suffocating cyan green palette with low-angle backlights that created an ever-present roof of light, the digital spider blended flawlessly into the physical set. Finally, they perfected what is known as scale compositing. By combining traditional forced perspective with dynamic moving cameras, Weta allowed our small hobbits and dwarves to interact seamlessly with the towering characters in the exact same moving frame. It was a technical leap that perfectly reinforced the core theme of the story, the small and vulnerable standing against monumental, overwhelming forces. But building a digital orc or a giant spider in a computer is only half the battle. To truly sell the terror of Sauron's army in extreme close-ups, they needed something physical. tangible nightmares that the actors could actually look at and react to on set. They needed the physical craftsmen to step in and build the rest of Middle-earth by hand. If Massive gave the armies of Mordor a brain, Richard Taylor and Peter King gave them a face, and the Academy recognized exactly what an exhausting, monumental task that was. During the assembly cuts of the film, Peter Jackson looked at his standard Mordor orcs and realized that there was a problem. Compared to the massive, terrifying Uruk-hai of the previous films, they looked a little pathetic. So, under immense time constraints during the pickup shots, Jackson ordered the creation of what he called the Uber Orcs, essentially the SAS of Sauron's forces. The most prominent result of this mandate was Gothmog, the orc commander at the Siege of Gondor, whose heavily deformed, asymmetrical face required hours of grueling application every single day to become the focal point of terror on the battlefield. But the makeup team didn't just rely on traditional foam latex. They secured this Oscar by pioneering a disturbing hybrid of practical prosthetics and digital enhancement. Take the mouth of Sauron. To create that deeply unsettling, unnatural grin, they applied practical makeup to the actor and then digitally enlarged his mouth by 200% in post-production. They used a similar technique for the King of the Dead, blending practical facial appliances with digital morphine to reveal his skull-like form based on the character's emotional volatility. Ultimately, though, this award was a testament to sheer human endurance. Cast members portraying dwarves and orcs spent years practically suffocating under the thick silicone and latex. John Rhys Davies, who played Gimli, suffered from severe allergic reactions to his prosthetics for the entire shoot, famously tossing his final Gimli mask into a fire the moment his filming wrapped in a pure act of catharsis. When Richard Taylor accepted the Oscar, he made sure to thank the actors for enduring the rubbery feet and funny noses, while praising their incredible ability to still emote through the inches of artificial skin. Of course, those terrifying faces wouldn't mean much if the armies were charging into battle wearing generic Hollywood armor. To truly sell the history of these cultures, they needed garments forged with the exact same level of obsessive, torturous detail. Nyla Dixon and Richard Taylor didn't just win Best Costume Design for making pretty outfits. They won it for overcoming the sheer logistical nightmare of outfitting an entire fictional universe. The numbers alone are staggering. Over the course of the production, the Weta Workshop team manufactured 19,000 distinct costumes and 48,000 pieces of armor. But it's how they made them that secured the gold. Take the armor. Traditional metal chainmail rings were too heavy, too expensive, and entirely impractical for thousands of background extras. To solve this, Weta engineered a proprietary homemade rig designed to slice standard PVC plumbing into millions of individual plastic rings. Crew members then meticulously linked these rings together by hand into massive tunics, which were electroplated to look like authentic, battle-worn steel. The manual labor was so intensely repetitive that the crew famously wore the fingerprints right off their thumbs. Beyond the industrial-scale manufacturing, the costume design was deeply rooted in character symbolism. You can see this most clearly in the final coronation sequence. Arwen's gown, painstakingly dyed pale green silk velvet with an inner dress of white lace, and her butterfly crown were designed to specifically frame her elven ears, visually representing the rebirth, hope, and healing of Middle-earth. Conversely, Aragorn's heavy coronation armor wasn't just meant to look cool. It was designed to convey the absolute gravity of his new kingship. Pulling historical inspiration from figures like King Alfred the Great, the costume visually anchors his completed character arc. It represents the heavy mantle of leadership and, somewhat tragically, the poignant loss of his freedom as a wandering ranger. But dressing the characters in history is only half the illusion. You have to place those characters in a world that feels just as ancient and physically real. Grant Major, Dan Henneth, and Alan Lee took home this award by beating out massive prestige heavyweights like Master and Commander and The Last Samurai. They won because their defining achievement wasn't just designing fantasy sets. It was their unwavering commitment to constructing the weight of history. Peter Jackson had a strict mandate from day one. Middle-earth could not look like a pristine, shiny fantasy concept. It had to look weathered and lived in. It had to bear the scars of centuries of fictional history. Conceptual artists Alan Lee and John Howe produced highly detailed illustrations for virtually every shot, which served as the literal architectural blueprints for the film. Because they were shooting 3 massive epics simultaneously, the physical sets required extreme modularity. Here's an incredible detail. The multi-tiered, towering city of Minas Tirith was actually built using parts completely cannibalized from the Helm's Deep set used in the 2 towers. For the sweeping, impossibly wide shots that physical sets couldn't accommodate, the art department relied on massive, hyper-detailed miniatures. The crew affectionately dubbed these bigatures. Take the Dark Tower of Barad-dûr. In Tolkien's lore, the tower is estimated to be 5,000 feet tall. Weta Workshop built a staggering physical miniature that utilized forced perspective to sell its impossible ominous height to the camera. But building these sets and bigatures was only part of the magic. They had to be perfectly integrated. The art direction was deeply codependent with Andrew Lesnie's cinematography. To capture the white stone city of Minas Tirith without the film succumbing to magenta or green lab color aberrations, the team developed a classic graphic pewter look. Furthermore, they used a complete motion control system known as Tech B to track Lesnie's live-action camera movements and apply them precisely to the miniature shots. They matched the live-action lighting, replicating key-to-fill ratios, contrast, and light texture flawlessly. This seamless blending of physical sets, bigatures, and unified lighting design is what gave Middle-earth its subconscious sense of absolute reality. But building a physically real world is only the first step. It's an important one, and those first 4 awards that we just discussed all contributed to solidifying the physical dominance of the film. But now we need to dive into the awards that gave Middle-earth a voice. After all, you have to fill the air with dread, hope, and the visceral clash of steel, which brings us out of the physical craft and into the invisible magic of the film. While it was the very last thing audiences heard as the screen faded to black, the best original song, Into the West, is far from a footnote in this historic sweep. Awarded to the trio of Annie Lennox, Fran Walsh, and Howard Shore, this wasn't just a catchy pop track added to the end credits to sell soundtracks. It was the emotional climax of a 10-hour saga. Interestingly, this wasn't the original plan. Initially, the credits were slated to feature a song titled Frodo's Song, where Frodo actually sings to Samwise as he departs Middle-earth. But Peter Jackson realized it didn't quite hit the perfect, melancholic tone of finality needed to close out the trilogy. The song they ultimately created was born out of a deeply personal, real-world tragedy. During production, Peter Jackson and his team befriended Cameron Duncan, a teen filmmaker in New Zealand whose boundless passion for cinema had blown them away. Tragically, Cameron was fighting a losing battle with cancer. His passing profoundly impacted Jackson, Walsh, and Shore, and it directly inspired the thematic score and emotional frequency of Into the West. Conceived as a bittersweet elvish lament for those crossing the sundering sea, the lyrics are a beautiful, profound meditation on mortality, the fading of hope into rest, the letting go of earthly burdens, and the promise of meeting again on white shores. Performed with resonant clarity by Annie Lennox, the song provided a much-needed cathartic release for an audience that had just witnessed the breaking of the Fellowship forever. In a fitting tribute, the song actually received its first public performance at Cameron Duncan's funeral. But what makes this win so undeniably deserved is that the melody isn't isolated to the credits. It's intricately woven into the DNA of the film much earlier. If you listen closely during the darkest hour of the Siege of Gondor, when Gandalf is comforting a terrified Pippin by describing the afterlife, the instrumental motif of Into the West plays softly in the background. It's a masterful stroke that ties the script, the song, and the score into one unified thematic statement. Of course, weaving a lyrical motif so flawlessly into the background of a scene requires a maestro who truly understands the heartbeat of Middle-earth. Howard Shore didn't just write a soundtrack for The Return of the King, he composed a monumental 10-hour operatic tapestry. To pull off this final, grueling leg of the journey, Shore essentially had to act as the composer, orchestrator, conductor, and producer all at once. If you look back at the score for The Fellowship of the Ring, it relied heavily on singular, easily identifiable themes to establish the world. But for The Return of the King, the music had to evolve. Middle-earth was fracturing. The characters were scattered and facing the apocalypse. To reflect this, Shore took fragments of established ideas and matured them into what musicologists call dissonant mosaics. The beloved musical motifs overlap and clash in different rhythms and progressions to represent the chaos of warfare and the encroaching darkness of Mordor. Recording incrementally with the London Philharmonic Orchestra, Shore brought in heavy-hitting soloists to convey distinct conceptual tones. He even tapped into the cast, integrating Billy Boyd's haunting rendition of The Edge of Night over the Siege of Osgiliath, and allowing Viggo Mortensen to provide a solo vocal performance during Aragorn's coronation. Now, from an audiophile perspective, the final theatrical mix of Shore's score actually generated a bit of controversy among film music purists. Shore and the audio crew deliberately utilized a bass-heavy, echoing acoustic profile. This wet, concert hall-like sound was meant to maximize the sheer mass and monumental weight of the orchestral swells. Some critics argued that this washed out the clarity of individual instruments in favor of overwhelming sonic power, but it undeniably matched the overwhelming visual scale of the film, and ultimately, that's the job of a film score. But composing a monumental, bass-heavy score is only half the auditory battle. Someone actually had to figure out how to weave that towering music through the deafening roar of 10,000 clashing swords, screaming Nazgul, and crumbling stone without losing a single note of dialogue. The Oscar for Best Sound Mixing went to Christopher Boyes, Michael Semenick, Michael Hedges, and Hammond Peake. Their monumental task was achieving the architecture of acoustic chaos, perfectly balancing the thunderous epic warfare with subtle emotional nuances of the narrative. Take the blood-curdling shriek of the Nazgul. It's one of the most iconic, heavily analyzed sonic achievements of the trilogy, and the sound design team initially struggled to find an acoustic profile that was sufficiently terrifying. The final piercing sound was actually born of a deeply unexpected source: Fran Walsh. Jackson's wife, co-producer, and co-writer literally recorded herself screaming at the top of her lungs. Sound designers then took her raw vocal recordings and layered them with the squeals of a pig and the bizarre acoustic scrapings of 2 plastic cups. This incredibly strange amalgamation produced a mechanical yet organic screech that sliced perfectly through the heavy bass of the battle sequences. But the real genius of the sound mixing for The Return of the King wasn't just knowing when to make things loud, it was the masterful application of less is more. During the overwhelming battle of the Pelennor Fields, the mixers carefully filtered the auditory information to prevent total sensory exhaustion. For example, when the massive Oliphants charge across the plains, the team deliberately muted the impact sounds of their back legs. By only including the footfalls of their front legs, the mixers literally cut the auditory clutter in half. This maintained the rhythmic, earth-shattering terror of the beasts without reducing the scene to an unintelligible wall of noise. It's why you can still perfectly hear the dialogue and Howard Shore's score amidst the carnage. They applied the same restraint to the Army of the Dead. Instead of relying on the bombastic, clinking sounds of metal swords and armor, they utilized ethereal audio. They leaned into the heightened strings, Tibetan gongs, and whispering, overlapping vocal tracks to convey a supernatural tension that completely stood out from the physical crunch of the orc armies. But having the best sights and sounds in the world doesn't mean anything if the story itself falls apart. While these last 3 wards that we just discussed are truly magnificent, you still need master architects to build the foundation and to brutally cut away the excess. The Oscar for Best Adapted Screenplay was awarded to Fran Walsh, Philippa Boyens, and Peter Jackson. And let me tell you, adapting the final volume of Tolkien's sprawling, linguistically dense saga wasn't just about translating dialogue from page to screen. It was about performing structural surgery. The evolution of this screenplay was wild. Back in 1997, when the project was still envisioned as a 2-film adaptation, early drafts included things like Arwen fighting at the Battle of Helm's Deep. But as this project expanded into a definitive trilogy, the writers made a crucial decision to completely realign the timeline. Instead of following the strict interlaced structure of Tolkien's novel, they mapped the script onto the chronological timeline laid out in the book's appendices. This meant violently ripping major sequences that occurred in the middle of the Two Towers book, like the encounter with Shelob and the subplot with the Palantir, and shoving them into the beginning of the Return of the King film to build massive, undeniable momentum. But to maintain that cinematic momentum for a satisfying climax, the writers had to be absolutely ruthless with their omissions. For example, take the Scouring of the Shire. In the source text, the hobbits return home only to find the Shire industrialized and corrupted by Saruman, leading to one final bloody conflict. From a screenplay perspective, dropping a brand new localized war onto the audience immediately following the emotionally exhausting destruction of Mount Doom would have completely shattered the film's climax. So they excised it entirely, relegating it to a hypothetical psychic vision in the first film to preserve the emotional purity of the Hobbit's return. They faced a similar structural dilemma with Saruman himself. Killing the primary antagonist of the second film at the very beginning of the third created massive narrative dissonance. Sauron needed to be rapidly established as the singular ultimate threat. Consequently, Saruman's death was cut from the theatrical release altogether, violently streamlining the narrative focus toward the Siege of Gondor. But perhaps their most brilliant structural choice was choosing heart and emotion over tedious explanations. In the book, there is a massive sprawling section called Many Partings that details exactly how, when, and where all the members of the Fellowship separate and go their own ways. While this is incredible in book format, and it's actually one of my favorite chapters in Tolkien's writings, the writing team knew that this would absolutely kill the pacing of the film. So, instead of bogging the audience down in logistical exposition, they consolidated that emotional payoff into the coronation sequence. They wrapped up the core thematic arc of the entire trilogy in one simple, earth-shattering line from Aragorn: "My friends, you bow to no one." It delivered all the necessary closure without sacrificing an ounce of emotional weight. But writing a beautifully resonant and bittersweet 45-minute climax on the page is one thing. Actually pacing things out and editing the movie in a way that keeps the audience watching, well, that requires a master in the cutting room. Jamie Selkirk won the Oscar for Best Film Editing, taking on the sole editing duties for The Return of the King after serving as a supervising editor and co-producer for the entire trilogy. To call his task logistically monumental would be an understatement. Because Peter Jackson often shot with 2 cameras simultaneously, and occasionally rigged up to 4 cameras for high-speed action sequences, Selkirk had to synthesize an absolutely overwhelming mountain of footage. It's estimated that he had to sort through approximately 2 million feet of raw film. To handle it, the editing suite utilized 6 avid film composers, with their digital storage ballooning from an initial 680 gigabytes to a then unfathomable 3 terabytes by the end of production. Selkirk's workflow was aggressively fragmented. He actually performed an initial assembly edit of the third film way back in 2000 just to make sure the base narrative functioned, before putting it entirely on the shelf to focus on finishing the first 2 movies. When he finally resumed the primary edit for The Return of the King in January of 2003, he was staring down a bloated, unwieldy cut that ran over 4.5 hours long. Because the film possessed so many heavy VFX sequences, he often had to cut scenes using rough wireframes and grayscale placeholder animations, constantly updating his timeline as Weta Digital delivered over 120 finished effects shots per week. The film also relied heavily on a digital intermediate process, which was still relatively novel at the time. Every single shot was scanned at 2K resolution, allowing Selkirk and the color graders to seamlessly match the live-action drama footage with the heavy CGI elements. This allowed for some incredible, highly selective digital adjustments. For example, during chaotic, dirt-filled battle scenes, the team used selective power windows to digitally sharpen only the actors' eyes. This subconsciously directed the audience's focus straight to the emotional performance without inadvertently highlighting the gritty film grain on their cheeks. But the sprint to the finish line was notoriously chaotic. By July 2003, mere months before release, the film was still glaringly unfinished. Selkirk and Jackson were actually forced to relocate their entire editing suite to the United Kingdom in August just so they could cut the movie right alongside composer Howard Shore's live scoring sessions. The final 5 reels of the film were eventually locked back in New Zealand during the final 4 weeks of production. Because those reels had to be mixed wildly out of chronological order just to meet the extreme deadlines, here is an absolutely mind-blowing fact. Jamie Selkirk and Peter Jackson didn't actually watch the finished film in its entirety until the world premiere at the Embassy Theatre in Wellington on December 1st, 2003. And those are 2 of the awards given to the architects behind this massive story. But there's still one architect left. And that brings us to the final 2 awards that the Academy was reluctant to give for the last 75 years to a fantasy film. When Peter Jackson took the stage to accept the Academy Award for Best Director, he didn't just beat out a few casual nominees. He triumphed over an absolute gauntlet of legendary filmmakers, including Clint Eastwood for Mystic River, Sofia Coppola for Lost in Translation, and Peter Weir for Master and Commander. But Jackson's victory was undeniably earned, and his achievement here is perhaps best understood through the lens of sheer, terrifying physical stamina. We're talking about 274 days of continuous principal photography, stretching from October 1999 to December 2000, followed by an additional 3 years of post-production and pickup shoots. Jackson was tasked with maintaining one cohesive creative vision across multiple shooting units that were operating simultaneously all over the diverse landscapes of New Zealand. On any given day, his production could generate up to 40,000 feet of film. He was essentially running a small country. But what truly elevated Jackson's direction to Oscar-worthy status wasn't just his ability to manage logistics. It was his philosophical approach to performance amidst all of that chaos. Despite the reliance on green screens, massive visual effects set pieces, and thousands of background extras, Jackson maintained a fiercely actor-driven staging methodology. Instead of forcing his cast to hit rigid, pre-programmed technical marks that would constrain their acting, Jackson allowed the staging and camera blocking to emerge organically from what the actors were actually doing in the moment. He understood that the intimate, emotional resonance of these characters, like the heartbreaking psychological fracturing of Frodo Baggins or the tragic schizophrenic dualism of Gollum, could never be swallowed up by the spectacle of digital armies. His ability to switch effortlessly between directing a macro-level siege with millions of digital agents and then pivoting to a micro-level emotional betrayal on a claustrophobic set cemented his status as a master filmmaker. But a director is only as good as the final tapestry they weave. Jackson didn't just direct a great fantasy film, he orchestrated a cinematic miracle. And when the final envelope of the night was opened, the Academy finally admitted what the rest of the world already knew. And finally, the award that truly mattered. The validation of an unprecedented, insane logistical gamble. When Steven Spielberg opened the final envelope of the night and simply announced, "It's a clean sweep," the theater erupted. There was an extended standing ovation as the entire crew and cast of The Lord of the Rings, who were seated in the theater, made their way to the stage, essentially filling up the whole thing. And it wasn't just a victory for a single film. It was a historical paradigm shift for genre cinema. To really understand the magnitude of this win, you have to look at the competitive landscape of 2003. Look at the films The Return of the King defeated: Lost in Translation, Master and Commander, Mystic River, and Seabiscuit. Every single one of those films was a traditional, risk-averse prestige studio project. In fact, at the time of the ceremony, not a single one of those competing nominees had even crossed the $100 million mark at the box office. In profound contrast, The Return of the King was the culmination of a massive financial risk by New Line Cinema. It cost $94 million for this final film alone, and it went on to gross an earth-shattering $1.14 billion worldwide. It was a cultural juggernaut, flattening intimate indie dramas and historical epics alike. But more importantly, this victory shattered that 75-year-old institutional bias that we talked about at the beginning of this video. Historically, high fantasy had been marginalized as a lightweight, escapist popcorn entertainment. But by treating Tolkien's world with rigorous historical gravity, exploring complex themes of mortality and industrialization, Jackson forced the Academy to reevaluate the genre entirely. This Best Picture win was the ultimate retroactive coronation for the sustained excellence of the entire trilogy. It was the industry looking at a feat they previously thought impossible, producing 3 interconnected epics simultaneously, and finally acknowledging that fantasy could achieve the highest echelons of cinematic art. The sweep was complete, and the king had finally returned. As always, I want to thank Jason, Joshua, Timothy, RoboSteve, and the rest of my incredible Patreon and YouTube members who help make these videos possible every month. If you want to get behind-the-scenes access and early video releases, head over to Patreon, where you can support the channel for as little as $3 a month. I purposefully don't outright ask for members a lot because I don't want to be one of those channels. but as a small creator, it really does help to have supporters on my sideline every month. It's also why I waited until the end of the video to plug that, because if you're still watching, you're a real one. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the Return of the King's iconic win in 2004. Have a great week, and I'll see you in the next video.